So let's simply start, I think, so with our next session with an extremely broad title, so State of the Art in Climate Impact Research. But luckily we have some very good people here to guide us today within this large area. And the first one is Rupert Seidl from the University of Natural Resources and Life Sciences in Vienna with a talk on the impacts of climate change on forest ecosystems. Thank you.
Thing working? Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me here. I'm really glad to be here, and I'm really happy to opening this session on impacts. Thanks also for those of you who found the way back into the auditorium here from the coffee. I know it's hard competition, you know, forests, coffee, so, you know, to make your decision. So I'm happy to have you all back here. And I will talk about climate impacts on forest ecosystems. And I thought, since many of you are working in different systems, I'd start with a picture of the forests of the Earth. So where are they and how are they looking? So this is how the current distribution of forests on the Earth looks like. And if you put numbers on it, it's like 30% of the global land area are currently forested. And on those 30%, we have approximately 3 trillion trees. So that makes about 400 trees for each human being that we have on the planet. So for each one of us, there's 400 trees out there in our forests. Now, these forests are pretty amazing systems. And one reason is that on 30% of the land area, they're harboring 75% of the known terrestrial biodiversity. So 75%, 3/4 of all the taxa that we know currently of on terrestrial land is in forests. And you can imagine that simply by their prevalence on the globe and by the biodiversity they harbor, our forests have quite a big importance for the Sustainable Development Goals and for human well-being, so for the ecosystem services that we draw for our human well-being. And I want to highlight this with just briefly mentioning 2 examples. And one is a climate regulation, which is on the lower left corner there. And forests are taking up a lot of carbon. And you see basically the vegetation and the autotrophic organisms here in a diurnal circle taking up carbon from the atmosphere. And there's estimates that show that over the last years, forests have been cumulatively taking up between 30 to 60% of the anthropogenic carbon emissions. So the message here is, if it weren't for our vegetation and if it weren't for our ecosystems, the effects of climate change would already be much more severe than we are seeing them already now. Now, the other example that I want to highlight in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals is up on the upper right corner, and that's the provisioning of clean water. I mean, arguably, and we've heard a lot about human health already, clean water is very important for us as humans. And there's estimates that currently, looking at the freshwater supply, about 75% of the global freshwater supply comes from forested watersheds. So forests really being pivotal for the achievement of our Sustainable Development Goals. Now, but forests are impacted by climate change, and this is what I will be talking about in my talk here today. And I would argue that forests are particularly at risk from climate for 2 major reasons. One is trees are very long-lived organisms. So the potential for genetic adaptation, for adaptation through evolutionary processes, is very limited. Trees live hundreds of years, so when we think of our climate projections, evolutionary adaptation is really limited. And the second reason is trees are firmly rooted to the ground, so they cannot run away. They cannot find better habitat. They're just there. And so I want to briefly highlight impacts of climate change, and I want to bin this into 3 boxes. And they are the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I will start with the good. Because there are actually climate impacts that are positive for our forests. And we see those particularly when we focus on tree growth. what we're seeing when we look at tree growth from the past is that trees are growing better today than they did in the past. And climate change plays a role here. There's mainly two effects going on. One is CO2 fertilization, so having more CO2 in the atmosphere helps plants in general. And the other thing is forests in many parts of the world grow in temperature-limited areas, so warmer temperatures mean longer growing seasons, mean better forest growth. There are, of course, other factors, but I want to illustrate with an example from Central Europe. And I'm choosing Central Europe here because it's an area where we have studied tree growth for at least 150 years. So we have good longitudinal data on changes in tree growth. And this is a little bit of a noisy figure, but I'll walk you through it. What it's basically about is it's about how trees grow in diameter. And I want to walk you through with an example of how long it takes for trees to be 20 centimeters in diameter. So that cross-section that you see there. And I've indicated with this orange horizontal line here, the 20 centimeter mark. So if you were a tree that grew around 1900, it took you about 56 years to grow to a diameter of 20 centimeters. Now, if you're a tree that grows today, it takes you only 41 years to reach the exact same diameter. So based on those data, we can show that trees today, at least in this part of the world, grow between 32 and 77% faster than they did still 100 years ago. Now, why is this important? Remember that we have 3 trillion of these trees on our globe. So what those 3 trillion trees growing better means they take up more carbon. And what it leads to is what you see on this figure here. So the dashed line going up is the carbon emissions, the anthropogenic carbon emissions. And the gray line on the bottom and the colored trend lines that you see indicate how much of this carbon is staying in the atmosphere. And what you see is first it goes up and then it levels off and even indicates a little bit of a downward trend. So through increased tree growth, through increased activity of the vegetation, we also call it the terrestrial carbon sink. So through an increase in that terrestrial carbon sink, we actually see that less of our emitted carbon stays in the atmosphere, and that's good news for the climate. Now this has been the past perspective. So the question is, what about the future? And these are simulation results that were actually done here at PIC by my colleague Christopher Ryer. And they show for Europe, so these are different ecozones in Europe, going from the north all the way to the left, to the south and the right, that trees will continue to grow better in the future. So this is projections for the 21st century, over 18 different climate scenarios, so a wide range, but you see they're growing better. There's a little caveat here because I told you about CO2 fertilization. We are not exactly sure whether this effect will persist. So we know that vegetation has this thing that adapts to changing conditions. So if you consider a down regulation, you see that the boxes are going down. But the bottom line is, with regard to tree growth, the future is probably looking not too bad even on the climate change. But of course, there's a flip side to this, and this is what I'll bin as the bad part. And this is, now we've been looking at growth of trees, but of course there's also tree mortality to be considered. And tree mortality, as mortality of humans, we'll certainly be hearing more about, is quite of an intricate process, but it's linked to climate. And if we follow trees, so this is a longitudinal study where we've been following the fate of 230,000 trees distributed all over Europe for quite a while. So it's more than 1 million data points. And if we follow trees, what we see is that warming summer temperatures, particularly summer maximum temperatures, increase tree mortality risk. And this is what you see on the left here. So a year where the summer maxima are 3 degrees warmer mean about 40% increase in mortality. Now, interestingly, though, if we look at winter temperatures and cold temperatures in winter, warming temperatures in winter mean decreased mortality. So we see some compensatory effects there. We might see more temperature-related mortality in summer, but less temperature-related mortality in winter. One thing that we are pretty certain about, though, are an increase in abrupt climate-related mortality events from trees. And those can come about by things like fire, insect outbreaks, or also windstorms. You might have heard about the big fires going on in California right now. What you see here is observational data from Europe, so continental Europe. And over the last 40 years, we've seen these mortality events go up drastically. So about a 3-fold increase over the last 40 years. And if you're like me, if you see those kind of hockey stick figures, you might ask yourself, well, how is this going to continue in the future? So how will these mortality events change in the future? So we asked the question, and we went back to the literature, and we looked at all the information that we could find, analyzing several hundreds of papers. And in the end, what we found is, under continued climate warming, there's high likelihood that we're going to see more of those pulses of tree mortality. And you see that we see that effect all over the biomes, so all the way from the boreal forest to the tropical forest. There is an increase when we look into the future in these pulses of tree mortality. Now, you might say, well, if this is the bad, what's the ugly? And I would want to make that point. I mean, this is a meeting where we're interested in the effects of climate change, but certainly there is a large number of global change drivers out there happening simultaneously. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with this figure here, which sort of is a horizon scan on our global problems that we're currently facing, and climate change only being one of them. And I would argue that the ugly part that we might be facing is when drivers of global change here start interacting. And I want to give you an example of such an interaction with how a loss in the integrity of the biosphere and climate change are interacting. Now, what do I mean with integrity of the biosphere? I have another one of these hockey stick figures, and what you see on this one now, it's again time on the x-axis, and on the y-axis you have introduction of species. So we're basically shifting species around all across the world, deliberately or not deliberately, where species just hitchhike with global trade routes. Now, this distribution of species means that we're also distributing pest species and diseases. And this is particularly detrimental for trees, because then we have pests and trees that not have co-evolved over a long time, and where trees not have evolved adaptive mechanisms. And I show you an example of two here that are important for pine species, which is a widely distributed tree species, so a nematode and the fungus. And those are already present in Europe, but on a very limited area. So we looked at how can they spread given climate change. And what we found is that they can spread massively in Europe if we factor in the effect of climate change. So we have a massive interaction here between the effects of climate and the effects of the changes in our biosphere through invasive alien species. So with that, I'm already at the end, and I want to say that forests will also in the future continue to play a very important role in our biosphere, and will play a very important role for human well-being and the achievement of our development goals. And the effects that climate change will have on forests will vary, and there's positive effects like increased tree growth, but there's also negative effects like changes in tree mortality, and then we might see unexpected interactions between different global change drivers. And with that, my time's up. I'm at the end of my talk, and I'm happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for the excellent presentation. We have time for 4 minutes exactly for some questions. So.
Thank you. So when we think and talk trees, we're mostly thinking overground, but another fascinating side of trees is the underground, the soil. Can you say a little bit more what we know on how the growth underground will respond?
Yeah, this is a very, very good point. Thank you for raising that point. So, one thing that we're expecting is, as trees get more stressed, one of their adaptation mechanisms is that they're starting to invest more carbon into below ground growth, like root growth. That's an adaptation mechanism. For instance, if you're water limited, you want to grab more water, you want to be more efficient. We're still struggling a little bit, so another important part is trees have an association with mycorrhizal fungi on the ground. So this is a very important part, also a very important part of the carbon cycle. And I'd say as a forester, we have a tendency to study the JoJo story a lot. We're currently trying to understand these, and I'm probably not the right person to give it that. But there's a lot of knowledge coming online on that. We've recently, for instance, learned that trees actually can communicate underground by root connection. So communication in that case means there's really carbon transfer between trees and the forest, which we haven't thought possible before. So it's quite an interesting story also going on under the surface. Thanks for mentioning that.
Time for one further question, I think.
There's one in the back there.
Yeah.
Thank you for interesting presentation. There are some countries, for example, China, now making an effort to make afforestation on abundant agricultural lands in order to alleviate problems of climate change and pollution. What is your estimate in the long run? Do you think that afforestation, big afforestation can help or not?
You mean can help in terms of the effect of climate change?
Yes.
Or so I think so forests will play a role, and afforestation has an effect. So there is, and we see this already in areas where the forest area is increasing, which is mostly not the tropics, but the temperate and boreal zone. So that there is an effect of increasing forest area. Unfortunately, I also think it will not. So forests will not be able to solve our climate problem entirely. So they will make a contribution, but all the afforestation will not solve our climate problems. The other thing to note is, I think it's important to keep in mind the broad effect that forests have that go beyond climate. So there's a lot of benefits from afforestation programs in places like China, for instance, with regard to soil erosion, so stabilizing the soil, creating a better microclimate. So there is effects that go beyond the effect on the global climate here.
Okay, thank you. So the next.
We have approximately 3 trillion trees. So that makes about 400 trees for each human being that we have on the planet. So for each one of us, there's 400 trees out there in our forests. Now, these forests are pretty amazing systems. And one reason is that on 30% of the land area, they're harboring 75% of the known terrestrial biodiversity. So 75%, 3/4 of all the taxa that we know to make your decision. So I'm happy to have you all back here. And I will talk about climate impacts on forest ecosystems. And I thought, since many of you are working in different systems, I'd start with a picture of the forests of the Earth. So where are they and how are they looking? So this is how the current distribution of forests on the Earth looks like. And if you put numbers on it, it's like 30% of the global land area are currently forested. And on those 30%, currently off on terrestrial land, is in forests. And you can imagine that simply by their prevalence on the globe and by the biodiversity they harbor, our forests have quite a big importance for the Sustainable Development Goals and for human well-being, so for the ecosystem services that we draw for our human well-being. And I want to highlight this with just briefly mentioning two.
And life sciences in Vienna with a talk on the impacts of climate change on forest ecosystems. Thank you.
Thing working? Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me here. I'm really glad to be here, and I'm really happy to opening this session on impacts. Thanks also for those of you who found the way back into the auditorium here from the coffee. I know it's hard competition, you know, forests, coffee, so, you know.
So let's simply start, I think, so with our next session with an extremely broad title, so State of the Art in Climate Impact Research. But luckily we have some very good people here to guide us today within this large area. And the first one is Rupert Seidl from the University of Natural Resources